I am your host, James Morgan, and this is History of Cities. Episode 16 The Intermission. We last left off with the death of Pulcheria, who had effectively ruled Constantinople in the Eastern Roman Empire for the entirety of her brother's 36th reign, and then continued presiding over the imperial court during the first 3 years of her husband's reign. During her tenure, she and the empire had endured invasions from the Huns, internal strife within the Christian faith, attempted coups, and economic hardships. Despite all that she had to overcome, at the time of her death, the Eastern Empire was looking to be on the up and up. This was largely due to her choice in partner, Marcian. He was a striking contrast compared to the last two natural-born emperors. Unlike Arcadius and Theodosius II, who had been called from birth to the highest office in the land, and had been crowned as Augusti by their fathers when they were still infants, Marcian was of relatively humble origins. So humble, in fact, that there is very little known about his life before he married Pulcheria and became the most powerful man in the empire. We do know that he served in the military as an assistant to the influential general Artaber, and then later to his son Aspar. It was Aspar and another general who I mentioned led the defense of Constantinople last episode, who negotiated Marcian as the leading candidate in Pulcheria's search for a husband. It is quite possible that these two men elevated the unremarkable Marcian ahead of themselves in hopes that they could puppet him the same way the three empresses had ruled for the last 40 or so years. But Marcian proved to have much more agency than his predecessors, and though he still bowed to Pulcheria's mighty will during their marriage, he was not affiliated with the apathy or timidness that comes with being just given so much power at a young age. He was at least a fully grown, self-made man, and that gave him confidence to make bold decisions based on what he thought was best for the empire. It was his idea to stop paying the Huns tribute while they were tied up in Italy, fighting the Western Empire. He took it a step further 2 years into his reign when he ordered incursions into Hunnic lands as punishment for the last decade plus of raiding the barbarian empire had subjected the Byzantines to. This incursion proved successful on two accounts. Not only did the Eastern Roman armies inflict defeats on Hunnic armies for the first time in what felt like centuries, said defeats also inspired tribes of Goths and other Germans that had been unhappily living under the Hunnic rule to rise up against their oppressors. The unity of the Hunnic Empire that had made it such a threat during the reign of Attila, the Scourge of God, almost immediately fell apart upon his death. Once again, the Romans were able to deal with their barbarian neighbors by forging alliances with fractional tribes to play the game of politics rather than having to face massive armies of united enemies. In particular, Marcian rewarded the Ostrogoth tribes that had led the revolt against the Huns by giving them land in the Balkans. He expected in return that they would come to Constantinople's aid in times of trouble. This was a continuation of the settlement of Gothic tribes that had begun during Theodosius the Great's reign, and would prove a double-edged sword, as these allies would help Constantinople in the years to come, but as they grew in number and power, eventually they themselves would become the threat. But Marcian didn't have to worry about that for now. With this policy of mutual cooperation coming into effect along the Danube front, and no aggressive action being taken against the Sassanids or other rivals in the east, Marcian's reign was a relatively peaceful one, which allowed him to focus on the economic disaster that had befallen his empire. There had not been an abnormal amount of droughts or famines during the last 3 centuries, and the mining of precious metals had not dropped by any significant margin. Yet when Marcian accepted Pulcheria's proposal and ascended to the throne, the empire was in dire straits. One might not be able to see it if they walked the streets of Constantinople, as the remarkable amount of development and construction that had gone on since the city became the imperial capital gave the impression that gold flowed like water through the city. However, behind this gilded facade, the treasury of the imperial court was bone dry. This was largely due to the irresponsible budgeting of the last 3 administrations. Theodosius the Great had been nearly constantly at war, and armies cost a lot in both gold and grain. During Arcadius's time as emperor, his wife, Eudoxia, had spent lavishly in order to maintain her hedonistic lifestyle and drain the throne's resource by turning court life into a perpetual party. When Theodosius II rose to the imperial office, his sister, Pulcheria, would have none of this frivolous nonsense at court, but she did have her own plans for enhancing the spiritual value of Constantinople that did cost a pretty penny. But the most catastrophic blow to the finances of the Eastern Roman Empire came from the tribute that Theodosius II had agreed to pay the Huns. Before Attila took control of the Hunnic Empire, the sum had been a manageable 350 pounds of gold per year. Upon the scourge's ascension, this amount immediately rose to 700 pounds. And after Attila had brutalized the provinces around Constantinople, he extracted a whopping 2,100 pounds per year on top of what he had already acquired. Once Marcian had stopped Constantinople from hemorrhaging gold through these annual payments, and dealt with the Hunnic threat militarily, he still had the Herculean task of refilling the imperial coffers. In order to achieve this task, he did not take the obvious route of raising taxes. He believed that an increase in taxes would just anger people and put more strain on the imperial bureaucracy that was already buckling under the weight of the economic crisis. Instead, Marcian took the pragmatic approach of cutting down on wasteful spending within his government. By cutting away excesses and cracking down on corruption, Marcian effectively cleaned and oiled the machine of government so that it could perform its task of running the empire more efficiently. This worked like a charm, and by the time his reign ended, Marcian had left his successor with a surplus of over 100,000 pounds of gold and a bureaucracy that ran smoothly. We already went over Marcian's most important contribution to the state religion in last episode's discussion of the Council of Chalcedon, but I would just like to expand upon it slightly here. I previously said that the Council of Chalcedon bore the moniker the Ominous because it set the stage for many schisms within the church in both the near and distant future. In the case of the near future, the rejection of the Miaphysite position and the removal of the Patriarch of Alexandria from his seat caused a wave of revolts in the far eastern provinces. These provinces had large populations of Miaphysites, and Marcian sent his armies to put them down no matter the cost. The bloody quelling of the Miaphysite rebellion temporarily calmed things down out east, but the scar left on the relationship between Constantinople and its subjects never fully healed. The rest of Marcian's reign was relatively uneventful on the Christian front. Most of the churches he built were commissioned by his wife, and after her death, he was not very motivated to continue creating new ones in the capital. If we were forced to sum up Marcian's legacy to Constantinople and the wider Roman world, it would balance between 2 points. The first point is arguably in his favor, with the economic reforms he implemented leaving the finances of the imperial court in an outstandingly positive position. Many of the great deeds scholars write about for the next century of Byzantine history relied on this budget surplus to fund the emperor's ambition. The second point is either neutral or bad, depending on whether you are a fan of the Western Roman Empire. Marcian had always been a little chilly towards his Western colleagues, but in 455 he really showed his intentions when Valentinian III was assassinated. No, Marcian had not conspired to have his peer killed, but the violent nature of the change in power in the West gave him the perfect excuse to further the divide between Constantinople and Rome. He refused to recognize either of Valentinian's successors. The recognition of the emperor was just a formality, but it showed that the two empires were still at least nominally politically connected. At the time, any common person on the street could see that Marcian was attempting to sever the ties that bound Constantinople to its western brothers. From our vantage point in the distant future, we can see that the far more pivotal severance had already occurred during the Council of Chalcedon. The elevation of Constantinople as religiously equal to the Pope in Rome blasted an enormous hole in the relationship between the two cities. Politically and spiritually, the empires had already been splitting, but Marcian's actions brought them to the point of no return. Marcian had been 58 years old when he was proclaimed Augustus, and so his reign is markedly shorter compared to the infant emperors that preceded him. In 457, the 7th year of his tenure, Marcian died. He of course had no children with the virgin Empress Pulcheria, and the lack of any surviving male heir from Theodosius II meant that the Theodosian line ended with Marcian. He had hoped that he could choose his successor by organizing a marriage between his daughter, Marcia Euphemia, and a man named Anthemius. However, as Marcian's body was lowered beside Pulcheria's in the Church of the Holy Apostles, the Senate, and by proxy the people of Constantinople, looked to Marcian's old partner Aspar to choose the new emperor. Just as Aspar had arranged for Marcian to be Pulcheria's choice of husband, he was now again charged with the task of picking the man that would lead the city and the empire, at least in name. He probably would have chosen himself had it not been for two sticking points. One, that he was of Germanic heritage, and the second was that he was an Arian Christian. Only Orthodox Christians could be accepted as emperor, and so Aspar was forced to elevate someone else in his place. He passed over Marcian's chosen successor, and instead picked the steward of his house. Aspar hoped that by picking one of his servants to be emperor, he could puppet him and still rule over the empire, despite not being able to hold the most powerful office himself. But he would soon come to realize that the steward, whose name was Leo, was not the pushover he had hoped he was. A quick important note about the coronation of Leo was that he was raised on the shields of the legionaries to show their acceptance of him. This had been tradition for all emperors leading back to the very first. Where Leo broke from tradition was the addition of a ceremony in Hagia Sophia, which saw Leo being crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople. This event marks the beginning of the trend we will see throughout the Middle Ages, of the emphasis of God's will being a legitimizer of monarchs. Up until this point, the emperors were always said to be chosen by the gods, or Big G God, but it had always been an afterthought, whereas the input of the military on the legitimacy of government was paramount. Now the roles would be reversed, and the political power wielded by the clergy would rise astronomically. The break between Aspar and his ex-steward came very early in Leo's reign. It was predicated on good old-fashioned xenophobia towards the Germanic peoples who had begun, in the view of some, to infiltrate the empire since they were allowed to settle in previously Roman provinces. While some Roman citizens viewed the Germans as a barbaric element within their midst, it did not change the fact that many of these so-called invaders were important, contributing members of all parts of Roman society. From the civil bureaucracy to the military, Germans had been serving with honor for as long as they had been allowed in. Yet still there was bigotry towards these so-called barbarians, and it is unsure whether Leo was actually sincerely prejudiced against Germans, or if he just used that as an excuse to fight against Aspar's oversized influence over him. Whatever the case, the two men were soon on either side of a bitter split between competing ideas of who should constitute the core of the Byzantine army. Aspar, of course, supported his German countrymen, who had already proved themselves in the wars against the Huns and the Sassanids that Leo's predecessors had fought. Leo, on the other hand, was intent on supplanting these German soldiers with Isaurians, the people of the mountainous inner region of Anatolia that had defended Constantinople in its most dire hour last episode. The Isaurian faction was led by a man named Theodosian, but luckily for me, he changed his name to the much more manageable Zeno. He chose his new moniker because it had been the name of the Isaurian that had led the defense of Constantinople, and its Greek origins made him more palatable to the bulk of Constantinople's high society. Leo sealed his alliance with Zeno by having him marry his daughter, and since Leo had no surviving sons, Zeno was now in line to take the throne after his death. The battle between the Germanic and Isaurian factions would continue throughout Leo's entire reign, becoming the principal theme of the emperor's 17-year tenure. Now you might think that as Leo had been crowned by the Patriarch of Constantinople, and that he shared a name with Pope Leo I, who was one of the most influential bishops in history, that the cornerstone of his reign would focus on religious matters. If you did think that, you would be wrong, as unfortunately for us, most of what is written about Leo's time as emperor takes place outside of Constantinople. He didn't preside over any great ecclesiastical council, or commission any great building projects that have stood the test of time. There was, of course, the ever-present rumble of religious and political disunity within the capital, but this sound was drowned out by the deafening cacophony that was the ongoing and now imminent collapse of the Western Empire. Though Leo ruled from Constantinople for the entirety of his reign and never set foot in the West, the two events that history would remember him for would take place in that disaster of a brother empire. Both of these decisions that Leo made were born from an ongoing problem in the West that had somewhat recently risen to unacceptable heights. The Germanic kingdom of the Vandals, under their leader Gaiseric, had set themselves up in North Africa around the city of Carthage. From this base, they had raided the southwestern Mediterranean unimpeded by the pathetically weak Western Roman military. Finally, in 455, Gaiseric and his army sacked Rome, carrying off a considerable amount of treasure, the Empress Eudoxia, and the daughters of the late Emperor Valentinian III. For 12 years after the sack of Rome, the West was in utter chaos, with no emperor to represent a guiding voice of order. There was a political struggle between the Vandals and the Eastern Empire, on whose candidate would take up the throne of the Western Empire. In order to put pressure on Leo, Gaiseric expanded his coastal raids to provinces in the east. After a dozen years debating on who to send to Rome to become his colleague, Leo finally settled on Anthemius, the intended successor and son-in-law of Marcian. By sending Anthemius along with an army to escort him, Leo could rest easier knowing that a claimant to the Eastern throne was far away and busy trying to hold the Western Empire together. On top of that, it had the added bonus of blocking any further political expansion of the Vandal kingdom. Anthemius would be the last Western emperor to rule for more than 2 years, as he would be succeeded by a group of rapidly deposed or killed men that oversaw the final death spiral of the West. But for now, Leo still had to deal with the threat of the Vandal military placed on both the East and the West. In order to pacify the Germanic kingdom and get revenge for the sack of Rome, Leo financed a fleet of over 1,000 ships and around 100,000 men. The expedition would set out in 468 and be led by the brother of Leo's wife, a man named Basiliscus. Leo had been loath to appoint Basiliscus as commander of the fleet since he was Aspar's principal ally in the conflict between the Germanic and Isaurian factions. Basiliscus himself was not German. In fact, he was diametrically opposed to Aspar, both religiously and personality-wise. They did, however, share an intense hatred for Isaurians that put them in common cause. It took the combined pleading of Aspar and Leo's wife to finally convince him to give Basiliscus the honor of leading the campaign against the Vandals. It was a choice that Leo would soon come to regret, as Basiliscus was simply put, not the man for the job. The massive force under Basiliscus' command could have easily destroyed the Vandals, wiping them off the face of the map and avenging Rome. The massive disparity between the sizes of the opposing armies lulled Basiliscus into a sense of assured victory. Because of this, he was easily duped when Gaiseric sent word that he would surrender unconditionally if Basiliscus would just wait 5 days for him to get his affairs in order. Basiliscus complied and crammed his fleet into the harbor at Mercurion to await the Vandals' surrender. While all the Byzantine ships were tucked shoulder to shoulder in the narrow harbor, Gaiseric sent a small fleet of prison boats to Mercurion. As these vessels floated toward the Byzantine ships, they were set on fire and abandoned by their crews. The fire quickly spread throughout the Byzantine fleet, destroying nearly all their vessels and effectively ending the expedition without the loss of a single Vandal soldier. The failure was an immense loss not only militarily, but financially, as most of the budget surplus Leo had inherited from Marcian went up in smoke along with his ships. Suffice it to say, Leo was apoplectic. Upon returning to Constantinople, Basiliscus hightailed it to Hagia Sophia, where at least he knew the emperor could not have him executed. He stayed there for months until his sister managed to convince her husband to spare his life. Basiliscus was sent into exile in Neapolis. With the loss of his most powerful ally, Aspar saw his and the Germanic faction's position in the empire quickly slipping away. In a desperate attempt to regain his footing, Aspar took measures to turn the cold political war into a hot one. In 469, Aspar conspired to have Zeno assassinated, but the Isaurian narrowly managed to escape his killers. The escalation to violence made tensions in the capital rise even higher. In the following year, Aspar managed to get Leo to name his son Patricius as Caesar and arranged for him to marry Leo's other daughter, putting him above Zeno in the line of succession. The people of Constantinople weren't too keen on the Isaurians, but they hated the Arian Germans even more, and the idea of having one be their next emperor caused an outburst of rioting. The city was only calmed when Patricius promised to convert to Orthodox Christianity. It seemed now that the German faction had managed to claw their way back into the lead, but only a year later, in 471, everything came crashing down. Sources vary on whether Aspar's plot to assassinate Leo was genuine or a false flag cooked up by the Isaurians, but when the perpetrators were uncovered, it marked the end of Aspar and all of his sons. With their deaths, the Germanic faction faded from prominence, and the Isaurians took their place as the most prominent members of the political and military class. This would not be the last chapter in the conflict, however, as aside from the emperor and a few high-ranking officials, the Isaurians were generally disliked as much, if not more, than the Germans were. Subsequent emperors would have to deal with this problem, but the last few years of Leo's reign would be uneventful. In August of 473, Leo could feel that his time on Earth was coming to a close, and so he officially named who would be his successor. To everyone's surprise, it was not Zeno, but his son who was named Leo after his grandfather. The boy was only 7 years old when his grandfather chose him to be the next emperor, and 5 months later he would be crowned Leo II by the Patriarch of Constantinople, following Leo I's death. Leo I had ruled for just under 17 years, and is probably the least deserving of the title the Great of any historical figure that was given such an honor. Now, the events I have gone over in this episode paint him in a pretty bad light, but the reason I only covered these points of his career is that they are really the only ones that can be called remarkable. On the whole, his almost 2 decades on the throne were just simply unremarkable. He left no lasting marks on Constantinople, and besides the debacle against the Vandals, there were no major military engagements that he was involved with. Leo was remembered fondly by historians, especially Christian ones, because he was a strict supporter of Orthodox Christianity, but this came at a time when there was no foundation-rocking heresy in the church to combat, unlike the previous decades. All in all, Leo gets credit for being a peaceful emperor who maintained order in the Eastern Empire, because there just wasn't much going on, at least relative to what his predecessors and successors had to deal with. In fact, the only truly big event that he had to deal with, the war with the Vandals, was immediately resolved upon his death, allowing its imprint on his legacy to fade away. Leo would have no great cities named after him, no monuments that could be seen centuries later, and no Hollywood dramatization of his life, but he was still called Leo the Great by some historians, for reasons we can't really understand. And so the death of Leo I left the Eastern Empire in the hands of a 7-year-old child. It was customary, when a new emperor was crowned, for the members of the court to bow before him and show deference. As Zeno bowed before his infant son, Emperor Leo II followed the advice of his mother and immediately proclaimed that his father would sit as co-emperor. This whole dog and pony show could have been avoided if Leo the Great had just named Zeno as his successor, as any normal person would have, but whatever. Only 9 months after the ceremony in Hagia Sophia, the young Emperor Leo II fell ill and died, leaving his father as sole ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire. As I stated earlier, the Isaurians were not well liked in Constantinople. The Romans and Greeks saw them as a brutish barbarian element, despite the fact that they had been subjects of the empire for nearly half a millennium. While they differed from the Germans in being Orthodox Christians rather than Arians, and were thus legally able to become emperor, this did not stop people from feeling like Zeno was a foreigner ruling over them. To his credit, Zeno did not take this bigotry personally, and did not let the people's hatred of him interfere with his job of running the empire. His first major act was to send a representative to the Vandal king Gaiseric to hash out a perpetual peace treaty that would end the Goths' raid on the empire. They managed to come to terms that allowed for the transfer of Roman prisoners and stopped the persecution of Orthodox Christians inside the Vandal kingdom. All in all, it was a big win for Zeno and the Eastern Empire, but it did very little to quell the anger that was building in the capital. This anger was being stoked by a conspiracy led by Zeno's own family. He had previously been on good terms with his mother-in-law, the now Dowager Empress Verena, and she had argued on his behalf when Leo II was enticed to crown him co-emperor. However, since then, Verena had taken a new lover, a man named Patricius, and she desired to have him replace Zeno on the imperial throne. She found common cause with her brother, the still exiled Basiliscus, who wanted to make a triumphant return to politics by ousting the emperor. Basiliscus agreed to help his sister install her lover as the new Augustus, but secretly he planned to take the crown for himself. The conspirators' path to the throne was quite simple. The people of Constantinople already hated Zeno because of his Isaurian heritage, and the Senate held similar feelings. Zeno's only base of power was the Isaurian element in the military that had been built up during the reign of Leo the Great. All that Verena and Basiliscus had to do was sway a few key Isaurian generals to their side, and Zeno would be forced to flee or risk a violent expulsion. It was Basiliscus who was finally able to bribe or convince 3 of the most high-ranking generals in Constantinople to turn on Zeno. On the 9th of January, 475, Just 20 days from the anniversary of his coronation, Zeno fled Constantinople with his wife, his mother, and all the gold in the imperial treasury. They made their way to Isauria, where they were forced to barricade themselves inside a mountain fortress when two of the traitorous generals pursued them. The situation seemed pretty hopeless for Zeno. He had no army, no popular support, and he was trapped in the remote inner region of Anatolia. The one thing he did have was all that gold he had plundered from the capital on his way out. The lack of funds paralyzed the government of the usurpers, which added immense stress to a situation that had begun unraveling from the moment they achieved their goals. See, as Zeno had snuck out the back door with all their money, the conspirators had already turned on each other. Instead of having Patricius named Augustus, as had been planned, Basiliscus had backstabbed Verina and convinced the Senate to raise him to the office instead. He then had Patricius assassinated, which completely alienated his sister. He still held the support of the people, the Senate, and the army, but as we will see, it will take him no time to alienate each of these groups in turn. We could already see by his handling of the war with the Vandals that Basiliscus was a bit of a dullard, but his reign is truly a masterclass in buffoonery, which is rivaled by few others. As Zeno was being besieged by the two Isaurian generals he had once called friends, Basiliscus made his first big mistake by not dealing with the angry mob that he had stoked in Constantinople to get Zeno to flee. This mob, hungry for the blood of Isaurians, finally hit a fever pitch and massacred all the so-called barbarians in the capital. This had the immediate effect of enraging the Isaurian generals, who now began rethinking their position in this whole coup situation. Basiliscus made his second big mistake when he tried to solve the issue of the imperial finances. In order to refill the coffers and get the government back in working order, the emperor imposed heavy taxes on all of his subjects. He should have taken a page out of Martian's book and known that people really despise rulers who raise taxes and prefer it when new funds come from cutting expenses inside the government. Now Basiliscus had begun eroding his support in both the military and among the people. The alarm bells should have been ringing deafeningly loud in his ears, but like I said, Basiliscus was not the sharpest tool in the shed. As his base of power began slipping away, the emperor decided now was a good time to brute force his religious agenda throughout the empire. The only thing that people liked about Zeno was that he was an Orthodox Christian, while at the time of his ascension, the only thing that people didn't like about Basiliscus was that he was a monophysite. Keeping with his bumbling character, Basiliscus issued a set of decrees that stripped the popular patriarchs of Constantinople and Antioch of their positions in favor of monophysite clergymen, and condemned the Council of Chalcedon. The people of Constantinople, who had so recently rioted against the Isaurians in Basiliscus's name, were now sharpening their pitchforks and glaring at the imperial palace. They were egged on by two prominent members of the capital's religious society. The first was the recently deposed Patriarch of Constantinople, a man named Acacius, who went through the dramatic show of draping the high altar of Hagia Sophia with a black veil to signal his opposition to the emperor's policies. He was joined in this opposition by a man who led the populace of Constantinople against Basiliscus. This man was the Stylite named Daniel. Stylites were a special type of ascetic who lived and preached on top of massive pillars. Stylites were revered not only for their Christian teachings, but also for their ability to live their entire lives on top of a column, seldom sitting, eating, or drinking, showing full commitment of body and spirit to their faith. Daniel had erected his column just north of Constantinople, and let me tell you, the weather in that part of the world is not always conducive to outdoor living. But Daniel had persevered through the wind and the rain and the snow for 15 years, until Basiliscus issued his ruling on the Council of Chalcedon. At this point, Daniel climbed down from his pillar to confront the emperor in person. Daniel's descent from his perch, the black cloth of the altar in Hagia Sophia, and a subsequent great fire that burned Constantinople, seemingly as an act of divine retribution, scared the emperor into repealing his religious policies, but it was too late to change the opinion of the population of Constantinople. Now Basiliscus was in dire straits. He had lost the will of the people, and Zeno had made common cause with his besiegers, and they were marching towards Constantinople. The usurper's last hope was an army under the command of his nephew that stood between Zeno and the capital. But Basiliscus's nephew was incredibly vain and about as intellectually gifted as his uncle, so he took very little convincing to switch sides and let Zeno through. And so, in August of 476, after a brief intermission of just over a year and a half, Zeno marched unopposed back into Constantinople. Basiliscus did the same thing he had done after his egregious blunder against the Vandals and sought refuge in Hagia Sophia, where he knew that Zeno could not get him. But this time he had no friends within the church, and Patriarch Acacius was more than happy to hand the traitor over to the now reinstated Emperor Zeno. Showing his magnanimity, Zeno promised to not have Basiliscus and his family executed. Instead, he had them shipped to Cappadocia, a region just east of Isauria, where he trapped them in a dry cistern until they starved to death. In return for allowing him free passage to the capital, Zeno also had Basiliscus's traitorous nephew killed. He did manage to repair his relationship with his mother-in-law, Verena, and now that all his enemies were out of his way, he could really begin his reign in earnest. But that will be a story for later, so please join me in the next episode, where we will go over the much more eventful second reign of Zeno. As always, if you have any questions or think I missed anything, please feel free to email me at hofcpod.cast@gmail.com or DM me on Twitter at HOFC_podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode, and please join me next time for the history of Constantinople.